So next one, we have panel discussion. So second panel discussion. So it will be led by the faculty group. So I think Faiza will lead this session, right?
Thank you, Junho. And
Okay.
thank you, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome. Today, I'm thrilled to be moderating a panel on decolonizing architecture education. The purpose of organizing a panel on this topic is to raise questions on about how to teach architecture in an institutional setting in a way that engages in social and political struggles. Our panelists today are faculty members at USC School of Architecture who share a deep commitment toward bringing in social and political issues into their research, practices, writing, and teachings in their respective fields. So without further ado, I just want to first make sure that all the panelists are here. In my excitement to get started, I did not check, but I'll just start by introducing them by name, and then hopefully they will be all present. So I will start by introducing our panelists. We have Yolande Daniels, Alison Hirsch, Ginger Nolan, Marcos Sanchez, Trudy Sandmeyer, Bhavna Sharma. I'm extremely grateful to all of you for taking the time to be here and to be a part of this panel. And I'm really looking forward to hearing your position on and pedagogical strategies related to a politically engaged architectural curriculum. So could I just make sure that everyone is here? Yeah. I don't know how that's done. Allison, sounds like a great idea. How can we pin everyone?
I don't know.
Okay.
You can just choose a pin. I think that makes you like go to the top. I don't know if
so
did that work.
I made you, okay.
I don't even know, so.
Yeah, I think I did one. I'm sorry about this.
I wasn't sure if that was out of the spirit of the discussion.
Yeah, well, that's part of the discussion, I believe. Add. Okay.
I didn't want to take up time, but I thought it might be good to be able to find us.
No, absolutely. I was literally feeling very blind, I guess. So.
All right, let me try to do this.
Oh, I pinned myself, but I don't know. I think everyone can just pin themselves. I don't know what it does. Honestly.
What it's doing for me is that it's showing just you all, the panelists, and myself, and that all works. Okay, and the last one would be Bhavna. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's on the individual screen then. I thought it was.
Oh, okay.
But
all right. All right, so we'll just get started, I suppose. Okay, so just to get the conversation starting, so I would really appreciate everyone who's in the audience as well. If you could post your questions, I would love to make it as fluid as possible. I have a few questions to start things up. The same goes for the panelists. If you feel like there's something that we can go in any direction. But I want to start with this general question that I've been thinking about, and that has to do with this term decolonizing in relationship to architecture education. So I just want to ask you, what does this term mean to you? And do you find this term appropriate or inappropriate?
We were sort of prompted with this question, so I at least thought about it for a little bit. And if we need someone to get it going. I'm very curious to hear what my co-panelists are going to say to this question, but I think I'm always a little hesitant to use the sort of catch-all terms. I think in landscape architecture, which is the perspective that I'm adding to this, is, landscape architecture, and I would also, imagine this applies across the board, is sort of built out of the colonial project, where we're tasked with sort of architecting land that, at least in the Americas, isn't sort of rightfully our own. I use our to sort of indicate those outside communities for which land was stolen. So, I like to be a little more nuanced with terms, just because of the nature of how they can be used and abused, but really focus on sort of dismantling legacies of oppression that have deemed some people, places, ideas more worthy of study than quote unquote others. And I in landscape architecture, for instance, it's very sort of easy for me to say, like, we're being asked to shape land that isn't necessarily our own to shape, or at least it's stolen, and that could very easily sort of stymie a student or stymie anyone. But the intention really there is to sort of have students and others in academia sort of build awareness, respect, and openness to learning from knowledge holders that might be outside the profession's bounds. So yeah, I mean, I think I have a lot more to say about it, but I think I'll just start with that.
Well, I'd like to add, like, in some ways, the word decolonization to me, it seems like a curious one because it seems a little dated. And I think that part of the problem with terms is that they can seem dated. So I was thinking of other terms. It could be like multicultural, but maybe that seems dated too. And then just, I don't know, I was reading Bell Hook's book, Teaching to Transgress: Education as the Practice of Freedom, which I recommend to everyone as a way of thinking about this subject. She quotes Cornel West, who just simply describes it as decentering Western civilization. And part of decentering it is to open up to other approaches. And so in some ways that seems a little bit less specific, like to a time, or like not jargony, and maybe more specific to the larger project. Like some now might say decentering systems of white supremacy, right? Like now it's okay for us to say white supremacy in public, whereas before it was very difficult to even talk about that, I would say 10 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago. So I guess what I'm saying is just that the project is what's really important. The term is less important. And it's more about opening up our educational methods to alternate approaches, and then just to approaches that support questioning.
Could I maybe add? Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry. I guess I guess I'm really interested in the idea that a person, or that we could work to decolonize institutions themselves. And if I imagine a smaller goal, the history of our own institution and its own history of practices, where was it 40 years ago? Where was it 80 years ago? Where was it 10 years ago? And that gives us an idea of a certain, not just pedagogical, but institutional and thinking trajectory, working trajectory that we inherit. And any maneuvers that we make are, I think, only to be read against that cumulative trajectory. The idea of taking action within our own institution seems fraught, difficult, full of risk. And I am happy to be part of an institution that is going through those changes. Whether we call it decolonizing or some other term that seems more apt, it makes me wonder what it means to us and what it means to our own institution. And then maybe I can figure out whether decolonization would be the aptest term.
I was gonna say, I have a certain fondness for the term decolonization, just because I think it's useful in that it helps just remind that the legacies are there, right? But I think where it can be problematic is that it sometimes tends to convey, and Marcos is sort of pointing out the obverse ways it doesn't have to convey this, but I think it does tend to carry the suggestion of geopolitical relations rather than the kind of, I think, sort of fundamental issue of it, elites and non-elites, which, has various dimensions, but it looks different in different places, right? And I think in terms of, decolonizing our own institution, it's a problem I run into my teaching, which is how to address a sort of a subaltern that is by definition not professionally trained through an institution that by its definition privileges professional training and histories of professionally trained architectures and forms of planning.
So I'll weigh in as the heritage conservation person here. I think it's a particularly useful term for the work that we do, in part because it's about looking back in order to look forward. And I think understanding that a place like Los Angeles, is a colonial setting with many layers of colonization over the top, as are many communities in the world, where various power structures have come in and taken over place and leave that residue in the built environment of those moments of colonization. And what does that mean? And what does it mean for how we move forward as a community? So I think, obviously I'm sitting here today on the traditional unceded land of the Tongva people in Pacific Palisades. And I think it's important to acknowledge that when I'm trying to remember to incorporate that into all of my teaching, because I think that's kind of a fundamental issue, and issues of indigeneity are a big issue in the heritage conservation world right now. And we're talking a lot about that, particularly in California. It has so many indigenous communities. And I think Allison certainly has been talking about that in her, in the lecture program that she's been doing this semester. So I think, but we were also a Spanish, colony and a Mexican colony, and, and then the Americans came in, so I think we have a lot of different layers to sort through here. And again, I agree. I think dismantling is a good word. Decentering is another good word. I'm not sure it's always about colonization, because I think that word gets appropriated to mean more than the specific narrow definition that I think many people would use for it. So I guess that's my take on it.
So thank you, Trudy, for that question, because that really segues in to the next question that I was hoping to ask. Again, anyone can jump in at any point. I also was really hoping to hear your thoughts. All of you, you come from different backgrounds and represent different fields. So I was also hoping to hear your thoughts on how, if you've attempted to bring in the, again, the term could be appropriate or inappropriate, but the sentiment of engaging in political and social struggles in your teaching. And so if you could talk about any strategies that you found exceptionally useful or successful. And again, this is not an easy thing to even begin to do, but I know that all of you are doing it in different ways. So I was just hoping to hear your thoughts on the successful practices or approaches towards teaching in such a fashion.
I am as I grow older as a teacher, I am more and more hostile to the jury, and I am more and more certain that there are very few juries where I have, either as a student or as a teacher, learned something. And maybe that is saying too much in too few words, but I think that at least in my studios, I attempt to produce, usually it's a table where the students and the faculty all sit around, invited visitors, the students as experts on their own topics, sites, and projects, and the faculty as and visitors as informed and clever participants. In that way, we get away from the idea of a solitary standing student defending their thesis using precedents against a firing line of people who are checking their phones. And I think that those kind of moments of systematic disrespect are key to a certain form of pedagogy that I don't understand well. But there is learning that goes on in that scenario, learning about hierarchy, learning about when to speak and when not to, which I think is deeply suspect no matter how often I see it in this institution or others.
Marco, I'm so glad you brought this up because it's been like such a pet peeve of mine since the time I was an architecture student, and quickly learned that even though sometimes it was said that students could talk, that we couldn't talk. And it's something when I don't teach studio, but when I have I'll have what I call respondents rather than jurors come, but even that doesn't change the nature of it, which is the students feel that this is the authority and that they don't even understand how much faculty's jurors are sort of performing for each other's benefits, and not for the benefit of the student at all, and sort of sometimes with almost like kind of a terrible one-upmanship in some of the worst juries I've been on. But the fact is they feel completely disempowered, and I try to often ask questions of students during the review process, but I realize that the rest of the jurors treat it as that it's a rhetorical question not to be answered, and they quickly jump in. And it's like, it's not a rhetorical question. Like, I wish this was more of a conversation, and I don't know how to change that, to make studio reviews more dialogic and less about the authorities who are judging.
Scott, this is Michael Resek. Scott Galloway from NYU talks about that higher education is about to face a reckoning, and the pandemic just sort of brought this to the fore. But I mean, if you think about it, higher education hasn't changed in 50 years, and within higher education, our design education certainly hasn't changed in 50 years. It's basically the same place we all walked into whenever we walked in. 3 afternoons a week, 4 hours an afternoon. That's 60% of your tuition. It's 85% of your time. Yet we feel perfectly comfortable talking about education, examination, and experience, but we never talk about the 4th E, which is earnings. Earnings for architectural graduates have gone down as a percentage of other professionals. So what's the deal? We haven't changed in at least, I know I've got 50 years of experience, 50 years, yet we continue to do the same thing. We continue to invite our clever friends to come in and out-clever each other, and Marcos, check their phones and go through that charade. And why don't we ever, if we want to decolonize something, let's just take it down to the foundations and start anew, not fiddle with the edges.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I know Mina's hand was up. Yeah, please.
Okay, lower it too. So one of the things that, I think we've all been questioning this, but it also should make us uncomfortable because there's the issue of we are supposed to be figures of authority, and that puts us in a place of privilege. We're supposed to know something to teach people. So it sort of begs the question of power and who's in power versus who's not in power when you're not. Like, leadership is complex. And I think great leaders recognize that sometimes you are the one there leading the way, but sometimes you are the one that is part of the group that is achieving the goal. And we all should be comfortable doing that. I think everyone here is. It's just the question of like, well, we're in this sort of faculty-student relationship. We need to hear their concerns, but there's also this idea that are we fundamentally dismantling civilization? I don't think we want to do that, because civilization has been founded upon organization, and this is related to architecture, order and society. And yet, so what are we doing? Are we doing surgery and taking the cancer out or whatever? Or I'm just bringing that up because.
Yeah. Thank you, Meena, for that. I think Yolande has a response to that.
So I wanted to respond because I feel that I've heard this response before, you know, about the end of civilization, that questioning the way that we do things, that, you know, that there could be alternate models, that in itself becomes a zero-sum game. So I think it's really important that it not be articulated in that way, because then we do end up with, well, it's the end of civilization and we can't do anything about it. And I just think about like my own experience with juries, like as a student, as a young faculty member, you know, as like an older faculty member, and it's as hard for faculty as for students to speak at times, especially if you're a woman or a minority in these kind of high charge environments. And I went through a phase where I just refused to go to reviews. And then I also did things like experiments where I invited only women to my reviews. I didn't have reviews that were conventional, where you sit in a circle, where the reviews are outside. I went through like all these different alternatives that you could do. And the thing about it is that other people are doing that. And so the question that I have is that we are not so unique. There's a history, I think now, of educators and people asking the same question and trying to come up with alternatives, but still the process stays the same. So I think what we have to do is try to gather all the strategies and tactics that people have employed and have conversations about them, and really try to think about alternate modes for education that enable students to have a voice, but also junior faculty and younger faculty who are adjunct to have a voice, because really what it's about is power, and we're not all empowered in the same way. And that kind of plays itself out in the education environment. And it seems to me that we could talk about content, and that, you know, when we talk about the curriculum and what books and whether decolonization is the right word, or that's about content, but then I think it's also about method. So the thing about changing studio culture is changing the method. And I think there are many ways that that could be approached. One of the things that I'm thinking a lot about, and I think the lecture by Fernando Lara this semester was really great in kind of calling out the relationship between abstraction, modernism, and the colonial project. Architectural education is founded in abstraction, especially core education. And I think there should be conversations about alternate approaches to core curriculum that maybe are more in line with the citizen architect approach, or a more social approach, that are not about abstracting and stripping people of their cultural backgrounds and unique identities. And that's something we don't know how to do. And I think the studio jury aspect is part of that. But I think it's really important that it's not about trashing it and throwing it away and then nothing happens. It's important that it be approached in such a way that there can be a conversation about it, and different approaches, you know, are discussed.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Trudy, you have something to say.
Yeah, I just, you know, I don't teach architecture. It's not a studio-based course. So I was trying to think about how this applies to the work that we're doing. And, you know, we're really trying to shift our conversations from the sort of top-down expert-led conversation to a much more community-based approach. But that includes the academic community as well. So, the reading course that I take, the students lead the discussion about, they each read a book a week. They lead the discussion and become their own critics of the different books, and the books are really wide ranging, of all kinds of different viewpoints and topics. And that ability to sort of be the leader and voice criticism of the sort of conversation taking place and engage at that level helps build their own confidence in their viewpoint and as their ability to articulate a different view, their own perspective. And I think that we collectively need to shift more towards that model of really giving students the ability to be their own best critics, and I don't mean that in a negative sense, but to interrogate their own themselves and their classmates and things like that. So and I think we all ultimately are experts of our own story, and so valuing that expertise of the individual and their lived experience, I think, is a big part as well of what we're doing in heritage conservation in particular. And that has led to a lot of, conversations about different viewpoints and different backgrounds and, how one person can see something one way and another person can see another way. And, we in heritage conservation have a longstanding, issue of white supremacy and domination, using the platform of preservation for enforcing a particular agenda or a particular story of the sort of wealthy white men of the United States in particular. And so I think, there's a lot of questioning going on about all of that right now and pushing back. And I'm excited about that. It's not the jury system. I agree with you, Marcos. It's bizarre for someone who's not from it or hasn't, I sit on juries and I'm just like, okay, what's happening here? But, I too am an outsider in this insider world because I'm not an architect. I don't have the secret decoder ring. And so I don't, there's a certain inside or outside thing that happens there too.
Can I just ask a question that was just brought up in the conversations that we've had just recent, like in the last few comments, and that had to do with the definition of decolonization or decolonizing. And so whether or not you like this term, if you could just put that aside for a second, and if the panelists and also the participants could just share what they think means by this term. What is it that we are talking about? Because I think we should have started there. I think people are taking away a lot of different meanings, and it might not be what it really represents in this context. So if, not to put anyone in the spot, if you have a good tentative definition that you would like to share, the panelists, or if the participants would like to put it on the chat. I know Sasha's hand's up. I'm going to go to you next. I just wanted to put this question because I really want some clarification for myself.
I thought Yolande, that's why I was thanking you in the chat for so much of what you said, but earlier when you were saying that we are not all empowered in the same way. I do think it's about structures of power and how they're manifest in various ways, and I'm so glad that you also brought up the system of academia and on the faculty side as well, because I think that's so important. But I had originally talked about decolonization as a dismantling. We talked about a decentering, but these legacies of oppression, colonial violence, racism that have deemed some people, some places, some ideas are more worthy or more powerful than others. And I think that, it's a really broad conception of what decolonizing means, but it can cross from everything from, how we structure our design reviews to how we, think of our broad curricular agendas.
Sorry,
Sasha,
yeah. Go ahead.
Just quick. I just wanted to build on this, what you just said, Alison, and building on Yolanda's comment about empowerment. And unfortunately, we can't do really directly something about this as a school. But for me, I'm coming from a very privileged background of, not having to pay a lot for tuition. And I had the impression that oftentimes the relationship between the teachers, the faculty, and students might change in a way where you accept a certain authority in a different way if you don't have maybe thousands, 10,000s of debt, or like kind of a obligation, that you have to fulfill a certain, certain time, certain study, because so much money goes into that. So for me, that, I don't know, if I would be in this situation as a student, knowing, that I have to take on debt, or my parents have to pay thousands of dollars, I would probably react differently in these situations where you have to, kind of defend yourself in front of your faculty and desk grids, because it has a lot of different implications. So I know that can be solved now, but I would propose that certain financial issue, making universities more accessible and not so expensive, would definitely serve a more flat relationship and more eye-to-eye relationship between teachers and students as well.
Ginger, do you have something to?
Well, now I'll just respond to what Sasha said, which is just that it's incredibly painful, right? Always to be the irony of sort of talking about issues of decolonization and hegemony in a university that charges $50,000 a year. But I also, just to answer to your question, Faiza, like, one of the terms that I use, I mean, some people could fault it for its lack of specificity, but I tend to use like the term hegemony more, like, and make that a sort of starting point in the courses some of the courses I teach, because I think because of its flexibility, right, and that it comprehends colonial and all forms of relations of domination. And I do, often try to sort of remind students that like hegemony happens at all scales, right? I mean, because people will talk about top down versus bottom up, and of course, scales of the house and the village are scales at which domination also happens, and not to sort of lose sight of that we're always sort of talking about competing modes of hegemony and different scales of hegemony, and sort of, so that's one term that I tend to use rather than decolonize often, or rather than, sorry, I just.
Faiza, I guess I have to say that I find it super hard to answer your question or your request. I'm going to just go ahead and I'm going to steal hegemonize Allison's answer and our answers, but one thing that makes it very difficult for me to think of a kind of umbrella term is, I guess, are the state, like in my studio, the one that is centered on UNESCO World Heritage Sites, that, where one student will look at Marshall Islands, one will look at Mexico City, one will look at Vietnam. And in each case, a kind of idea of post-colonial space or post-colonial territory seems to take on a completely different valence. And so it seems like the term itself is really great because it is so ill-defined. And there's something really fascinating about trying to keep it aloft, even as little pieces of it keep falling away when you try to apply it to specific sites or territories.
Thank you. Bhavna.
So I'm representing the building science, more the structural design perspective. So this isn't necessarily a topic that is something that comes up often in my discipline specifically. So just in regards to Faiza's question, I agree with Marco that it's a complex term. And I also want to pick up on the thoughts that Yolande presented at the beginning, that it's, for me, really about the structural aspects of education, which is something that I try to consider in terms of teaching. Structural design, structural engineering is based on principles that emerged in the 17th to 20th century in Europe, but it's well recognize that there are other feats of engineering and other understanding of fundamental principles that exist in the world. So it's important to recognize that, and that's increasingly happening in the field, but it isn't necessarily widely prevalent in terms of getting away from the basic fundamentals and where they come from, and understanding that there are other perspectives. And just to catch up on the teaching aspect of it, for me, it's really just looking at varying perspectives and recognizing that a lot of the principles that we have standardize our built environment and form our built environment no matter where you are in the world, and that isn't necessarily a singular way to see the world. And so that it's important to recognize that we have students in the class that are from a variety of backgrounds and parts of the world. And so trying to represent that in the classroom to me is really important. And also picking up on what Trudy said, really helping to develop a baseline of understanding as well as self-efficacy in applying engineering and mathematics to design is something that I really try to include to address even just a portion of these topics in structural design.
One of my points, I just remembered what I sort of got derailed by Sasha's point because it was such a central issue. But you know, one thing that I try to do in my classes, and it's hard in architectural history, probably all branches of architecture, is to dismantle the issue concept of authorship. And I think that is one of the fundamental forms, sort of kind of constructs in our field that help support some hegemonic relationships. But it's very difficult, because I think students come and they sort of want to learn about authors, right? And that's sort of how we categorize things. And universities also tenure people based on principles of authorship. And when people are interviewed, some people get asked what part of this, did you do or didn't do? And so it's a really problematic construct, because we all know that that's not how architecture works. There's not an author. It's collaborative, and so that is, I think, one of the kind of main things, along with, Dawn mentioned abstraction, right? That needs to be, I think, sort of dismantled somehow in architectural history.
Allison.
Thanks, Liza. I was, wanted to respond to this idea of authorship, Ginger. Here I thought I was going to be talking about larger scale curricular agendas and things like that, but I love that we're talking about what happens just in the classroom at a sort of really basic level. I think, because I teach history as well in landscape currently, that's my primary project, a history theory curriculum, and developing that class, the primary global histories course, or foundations, has been really a 10-year project. And I think, what's been sort of effective in the sense of questions of empowerment is inviting the students in. I think this has already been addressed, so I don't want to bring us into circles, but I received my PhD in areas that were sort of deeply embedded in sort of Eurocentric traditions. For those of you who know John Dixon Hunt, he was my dissertation advisor. So I'll always be an artifact of its construction, sort of Eurocentric dimension. And, even while I try to dismantle it, but, what I've found is, I've been working at dismantling it for throughout the past 10 years, but what I've found has really been sort of effective in the classroom more lately is being very explicit about this being a course in progress. And so inviting students to sort of voice where, the different geographies, perspective, life experiences they've had, to try to sort of contribute to the construction of this class that intends to be inclusive and look, cross-culturally. It tends to probably do a little too much of everything, but I have, I found that has been one way of sort of challenging authorship, in the sense of me standing in front of the classroom saying, this is the, the larger historical trajectory. Even if I'm, bringing in voices of all different authors and different precedents, it's still nice to have the students understand that this is a work in progress.
Can I ask what size is your class when you're talking about these classes? Are
No,
these like,
I know, Ginger, I like feel for
no,
you.
no, like I'm not saying that as a like, I mean, but it is like,
Yeah,
it's
no,
a-
no, no. I mean, it's just that's our program. So it's usually, around 20.
That wasn't meant to like deflate.
No,
at
no,
all
no,
what
but
you're-
I
what you're
know because
saying.
I've been looking at, and I'm just like, I don't know how you.
But it's
do
a
that.
huge issue because students, I mean, part of decolonizing, education has to do with giving students a voice, and it doesn't happen when all their history theory courses are 100 students usually.
And I would just add to that,
they have
yeah.
no voices, most of
Yeah,
them.
I would just add to that, Ginger, just sorry I'm interrupting because there's not enough time. I know Mina's hands up. And I have been hearing student voices in these kind of, there was a panel earlier today and then, in other ways as well. And they want the history courses to do that work for them. So it's like a real contradiction where, the students expect the history courses to carry that kind of responsibility, which is, I mean, we are happy to, but structurally it's also a big problem given the class sizes and all of that, which you just mentioned. Mina? Sorry.
Okay, so I think we all have to recognize that we are all products of colonized education. So I'm definitely one of you, Allison. And it's a struggle every time I think about it. But one of the things that I've been learning since I've been doing my area of communication and public diplomacy is I'm collaborating with people that are in neuroscience, is also recognizing that some of these things that we're trying to break down are human. And it's one of the problems that we need to recognize, that it is part of being human to categorize. It is part of being human to order. That's what we do for a living. And so by questioning these structures, we have to figure out ways of recognizing that we're doing something that science recognizes as part of our brain. And I mean in story and narrative, which is being used fundamentally in cinema, and recognizing that the brain works that way to identify people, okay? And the second thing is in regards to structure. And if we are going to figure out new ways, we probably have to find out another way of reordering. So I just wanted to bring that up.
Thank you.
Okay.
And I think that's what we are trying to do here, trying to look at the structure and try to dismantle it somehow. Any last comments, thoughts from our panelists? We only have 2 minutes, and I would love to end on one of your comments. Marcos, I don't know if you wanted to say something earlier when I cut you off. Not to put you on the spot, anyone else as well.
I feel like I say this at every every group, but I really do feel as if we're at the beginning of something, and I am, when thinking about not even being able to understand or come to a conclusion about what decolonization might be in the classroom or within the institution, it makes me think that we're at the beginning of something, and that there's going to be a lot of failures along the way. And so at least within the school, within say discussions among faculty, I always have my ear kind of like to the ground whenever I hear like that something succeeded or something worked, or like we've hit a goalpost, or we've really nailed something. Because I always think these are just preliminary gestures, and maybe that's really, I don't know, a kind of an arduous way to see this, but it seems like a hole that you've spent 90 years digging yourself into, you're not going to come out in 4 years. And there's just no way. And so, I mean, it's super amazing to be among the people who started our kind of like digging out. But it seems to me that when we look at our students' generations, it's really they who will, as Mina said, will maybe not have become products of a colonized institution themselves. And I don't know about you guys, but I'm a lot older than my students, so I'm looking forward to what they do, I guess.
I'm sorry, Abri had something to say. Thank you, Marcos, for that. I missed that thing. Abri, do you want to say something?
Oh no, I just put it in the chat, but okay. I am very happy that you all had this conversation, and I know some of you were there for the student conversation, so I'm just looking forward to that cross-pollination of professors and students working together to progress these ideas. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you. On that, I think we did excellent with time. So thank you so much. Thank you for the panelists. I really learned a lot, and I hope the audience also found this useful, this discussion useful. And I hope that this is just the beginning of more discussions like this in this future. So thank you for your time, and thank you for sharing your thoughts. And so now I'm going to hand things over to Junho, I believe.
Thank you, Faiza.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you for leading this great discussion. Yeah, thank you, Faiza.